On the night between the 16th and the 17th of July 2016, the fire brigade in Venice, Italy, had to urgently dispatch one of their boats to rescue a group of 5 young American tourists. The unfortunate 20-year-olds had spent the night stranded on a small deserted island in the Venetian lagoon. In a state of shock and unable to return to the mainland, they'd been screaming for help until a sailing boat took notice of their plight. Enticed by the morbid accounts published by news outlets worldwide, the 5 tourists had decided to experience the thrill of hunting for ghosts on that tiny patch of land covered in overgrown vegetation and decaying buildings. The American tourists were only a few among those who believed in the dark legend of Poveglia, described by The Times as, quote, the world's most haunted island. For today's exploration, we're going to be traveling to the Venetian lagoon, a body of water which separates the city of Venice, northeastern Italy, from the Adriatic Sea. The island of Poveglia lies in the southern end of the lagoon, less than half a kilometre from the shores of the Lido, a narrow strip of land which houses the district of Malamocco, once an independent port town. Seen from above, Poveglia actually appears as a set of 3 islets, with a shape vaguely resembling that of a fan or a Wi-Fi symbol if you want a more modern equivalent. Only the central body is the historical island of Poveglia, while the southern and northern bodies are artificial additions built in the 16th and 19th centuries respectively. The central body has a surface of 7.5 hectares, which is equivalent to about 14 American football fields. That's 10.5 when converted to European football fields. Fascinating facts. Amidst the thick, pervasive undergrowth, one can find the ruins of 11 buildings such as the distinctive bell tower or an undeniably creepy hospital. The island is owned by the Italian government and can only be visited after requesting a specific permit. Poveglia, in fact, is actually rife with danger. According to reputable sources such as The Times, The Guardian, and Italy's Corriere della Sera, the island's alleged dark past and supernatural entities may have driven residents and visitors insane, but Italian authorities are actually more concerned about substantial perils such as loose masonry crushing your ghost-hunting skull. And that takes us to a key question. How and why did Poveglia gain its reputation as a location infested by ghosts and the ever-lingering presence of death? While most searches for the world's most haunted places will return Poveglia as a high-ranking entry featuring highlights of its disturbing history. So, why don't we take a look at some of those alleged historical facts? Well, according to a regional edition of the Corriere della Sera, during the times of the Roman Empire, the tiny island was used as a lazaretto, that's an Italian word indicating a hospital to confine those who've been infected with the bubonic plague. This claim, however, can be easily debunked. The concept of a lazaretto or plague hospital was invented by the Venetians themselves only in the 15th century, long after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Moreover, historical records confirm that Poveglia was first inhabited and built upon only in the 9th century AD. Most accounts on Poveglia, however, establish a strong correlation between this land and the plague epidemics which ravaged the most serene Republic of Venice, as the city and its territories were known in the past. Now, to summarize these histories, either during the second sweep of the Black Death in the late 14th century or during a later outbreak in the 15th, the Republic of Venice decided to use Poveglia as a location to quarantine its infected citizens. These patients never left the island. After their death, they were cremated and their ashes were buried there. According to at least one account, patients might actually even have been burned alive. It's alleged that 160,000 plague victims found their death on that tiny surface, totaling 10 to 14 football fields, depending on your favorite sport. The natural consequence is that more than half of the soil on Poveglia is made up of cremated cadavers. These facts alone could certainly explain why ghostly activity has been consistently reported on the islands, and when I say consistently, I mean since the early 2000s, the golden age of blogs, when several ghost hunting sites started to mention Poveglia. These accounts added another element to increase the creep factor. Apparently, in 1922, Venetian authorities built a psychiatric asylum on Poveglia. According to rumors, the deranged director of the institution conducted either lobotomies or gruesome experiments on his patients, leading to their death. According to another version, he straight out, quote, tortured and killed many of his patients, butchering them horribly. Eventually, the unnamed doctor plunged to his own death from Poveglia's bell tower. He was either killed or committed suicide, haunted by visions of his victims. Somehow, this hospital remained in business for decades before being shut down in 1968. Then, an unspecified family bought the entire island. After months of terror, plagued by visions of ghosts and, quote, frightening otherworldly presences, the family quickly sold the island. Poveglia's reputation was then consolidated in 2009 when American TV show Ghost Adventures visited the island to investigate its otherworldly presences. The popularity of those episodes sparked the whirlwinds of haunting accounts, which are perpetuated to this day. In one of the episodes filmed on Poveglia, the lead paranormal investigator, Zach Baggins, is seen gripping a ladder inside the abandoned hospital. He then exclaims, "This leads up to the bell tower. This doctor that was treating the patients here went mad and butchered his patients. Shortly thereafter, this doctor unexplainably climbed this exact same ladder and then jumped to his death." And we ask ourselves, was it more of a paranormal murder? Baggins is later seen being overcome by intense, unpleasant feelings, becoming aggressive towards his crew members, apparently possessed by some sort of demonic entity. No wonder then that such intense, impactful experiences led to Poveglia's popularity and its rise in ghost hunting tourism. But you might have noticed a common thread about these stories. The details are very vague, the sources are non-existent, the claims are sensationalistic. Take the claim stating that 160,000 plague victims were at one time confined on Poveglia. They were either left to die there and then cremated or even burned alive. It appears that no one has questioned that number of 160,000. The average death rate of the bubonic plague pandemics in Italy was between 30 and 40%. An infected number of 160,000 would put Venice's population in the 14th century somewhere around 480,000. The city's population never breached the 200,000 mark, so the entire claim already sounds a bit suspicious. And, well, how about that tale of an asylum? Zach Baggins, while gripping a ladder in Poveglia, states that it was the exact same ladder. One wonders, how did he know this? Was there a plaque commemorating the event and location? But we'll further dismantle those stories a little bit later on. What matters now to us is to tell the true history of Poveglia, which may not be as dark and lurid as portrayed by paranormal investigators, but it still features its fair share of intrigue, war, and engineering marvels. To reconstruct the true story of a place, the most obvious choice is to sift through local archives and records. Due to geographical limitations and lack of digitized material, this was not an easy task for us. Luckily, we came across the work of two local legends, archaeologist Paola Soffermani and researcher David Bassato. If you're lucky enough to speak Italian, we highly recommend their book Poveglia, The Island at the Origins of Venice. We thank them for their efforts in setting the record straight for this small and beautiful island, and we hope that this video will help to amplify their message to the English-speaking world. Now, the island of Poveglia was first settled in the mid-9th century AD. Before then, it was just one of the numerous tiny islets peppering the Venetian lagoon. There are two origin stories on how the island was first inhabited. According to one version, in the year 845, the city of Verona entered a conflict with the peoples living on the shores of Lake Garda. The Republic of Venice sided with Verona, securing a crushing victory. In gratitude, the Veronese gifted the ruler of the Republic, the Doge Pietro Tradonico, with a contingent of war prisoners. The Doge resettled them on Poveglia, thus setting in motion the history of this tiny patch of land. According to another version, the first settlers disembarked in Poveglia in the year 864. At that time, Doge Tradonico's son and co-regent died, accelerating a conspiracy of aristocrats to oust the ruler from power. A group of 4 noblemen ambushed Tradonico as he was walking out of mass, overpowered his bodyguards, and stabbed him to death. The Doge's loyal servants locked themselves in his palace and staged a fierce resistance against the treasonous families. Eventually, the besiegers offered to parley. If the loyalists agreed to lay down their weapons, they would be peacefully relocated to an island all of their own. And you guessed it, that island was Poveglia. The loyalists settled on the island and received numerous perks, such as the privilege to produce and sell wine and salt, hopefully not mixed together. They were also allowed to return to Venice to sell fish, but only once a month. According to this second version, the original community soon thrived thanks to their vineyards and salt works, and several buildings sprouted on Poveglia. The island then reappears in official records exactly 3 centuries later in May 1163. A court document of the time notes how Poveglia was overseen by a gastald, or steward, an administrator with judiciary, civil, and military powers. The record also infers that, at the time, at least part of the salt works had deteriorated into swampy grounds, but the inhabitants still managed to make a living out of them by using them as fishing and hunting grounds. Skipping ahead another couple of centuries, in 1334, the tiny island was struck by disaster, a raging fire which destroyed 63 houses, leaving some 80 families homeless. The record of this tragedy is important, as it gives us an indication to the size of Poveglia's population. The demographic and economic growth of the islands may have prompted the Venetian council to decree that Poveglia would be administered by a podesta, a position which held more power and prestige than a gastald. On December 30th, 1339, the appointment went to Pietro Lando, who held jurisdiction over a territory extending beyond the shores of Poveglia. 2 years later, official records note how Lando's budget for Poveglia was as much as the budget granted to the rest of the territories under his management, an indication of the importance of this land. Lando's budget and salary were well deserved, as he had a tough task ahead. He was in charge of representing the Republic's government, administering justice as well as fighting the eternal enemy of the Venetians, erosion and periodical flooding inflicted by the tides on the flat terrain of the region. Moreover, in the second half of the 14th century, Poveglia became one of the main entry points into Venice. Thus, Lando and his successors were tasked with collecting taxes from traders and cracking down on wine smugglers. In September 1375, the Venetian government imposed for all merchants caught without the necessary trading permits to make a stop in Poveglia, where they could pay a fee and obtain their paperwork. So, now let's take a breather and reflect on what these records tell us. They tell us that Poveglia was quite an important place for Venice's lifeline maritime trade, and they take great care of noting the local podesta's duties and budget. And yet, there is no mention of the catastrophe which engulfed Venice, Italy, Europe, Asia, and Africa, the Black Death. This pandemic of bubonic and septicemic plague reached Venice in 1348. Allegedly, Poveglia was designated as a place where the infected were left to die in the tens of thousands, and yet no official record mentions Poveglia during the dark years of the Black Death. The overall death toll in Venice amounted to some 40,000 victims out of a population of 110,000. A terrifying ratio, absolutely. But again, no records attest whether any of those unfortunate souls died or were buried on Poveglia. Nevertheless, Poveglia would not be spared the ravages meted out by another horseman of the apocalypse: war. For centuries, Venice had vied for dominion of the Mediterranean against the three other maritime republics present on the Italian peninsula: Amalfi, Pisa, and Genoa. In 1378, the Genoese went on the attack, dispatching 50 ships under Admiral Pietro Doria. The commander secured the alliance of the city Padua, some 40 kilometers west of Venice. Doria's allies conquered the port of Chioggia at the southern end of the Venetian lagoon. This was a perfect staging ground to launch the final assault. With the enemy's ships at the gates, the Venetians' hopes lay with Admiral Vettor Pisani, who devised a cunning tactic. Pisani ordered for some large ships to be placed at the access points of the lagoon. Some were sunk, others manned with crossbowmen. In any case, the Genoese were trapped, cut off from their supply lines. The invaders retreated first to Malamocco, then to Chioggia, where they surrendered in June of 1380. Before leaving, however, the Genoese troops laid waste to Poveglia, destroying every building save for the church of San Vitale. The surviving inhabitants of Poveglia were now homeless and were thus forcibly relocated to Venice in the Dorsoduro district. This was the beginning of a very long exile. In 1390, the displaced families petitioned the Doge and the council, asking for permission to resettle into their homes, but their pleas were ignored. The island, however, would not remain entirely uninhabited. By the early 1400s, the territory of Poveglia was under the administration of the Old Reasons, a magistrature tasked with enforcing customs and tax laws. The Old Reasons decided to use Poveglia as a supply and repairing station for merchant and naval ships. Then, in 1423, the same magistrature agreed to pay a yearly stipend of 30 ducats to a priest so that he could celebrate regular masses in the San Vitale Church, one of the few remaining buildings spared by the war with Genoa, dating back to at least the 12th century. The iconic bell tower featured in most images of the island belongs to this church. The same year, 1423, saw the return of the plague to the canals of Venice. As many as 40 people died every day of the disease. Again, officials took great care of recording the salary of the local priests, but there is no mention of the island used neither as a hospital nor as a mass burial ground. The following year, authorities did decide to build a plague hospital on the island in the lagoon, but that honour belonged to St. Mary of Lazarus, not Poveglia. Some years later, in 1468, the Doge instituted a new office, the Magistrate of Health, who ordered the building of yet another hospital on the island of Lazaretto Nuovo. The purpose of this facility was to isolate for 40 days the crews of incoming ships if suspected of carrying the plague. The Italian word for 40 is quaranta, hence the modern word for quarantine. Fun fact. It appears that events concerning St. Mary and Lazaretto Nuovo may have been conflated and attributed to Poveglia. Now, going back to our favourite tiny Venetian islands, we now know that by the mid-1400s, it had been at least partially resettled by a small number of shipyard workers, custom officials, and one priest and his supporting staff. But the descendants of the original islanders yearned to return. In 1490, they were still living in Venice under the leadership of Gastald. In that year, said Gastald filed another petition reclaiming Poveglia. On this occasion, he received a positive response, but for unknown reasons, the much-awaited relocation didn't actually take place. We can only speculate as to the reasons for the failed move. It may have been that the island was simply too valuable to the Venetian government, as throughout the 1500s we find evidence of continued naval and military activity there. In 1527, the magistrate of the Old Reasons offered Poveglia to a religious order, the Camaldolese Hermits of Mount Corona, so they could build a monastery. The monks refused the offer of free real estate, not because they were afraid of ghostly activities, but because the crews of the ships stationed there were too rowdy and broke the silence that was needed for their prayers. Decades later, the din of sailors would be made worse by the shouts of soldiers and the roar of guns. Between 1571 and 1574, the Venetian military built the Octagon, one of two artificial islets which would contribute to Poveglia's eventual layout. This was essentially an octagonal fortress to be used as an artillery battery to defend the entrance to Venice's ports. The mighty guns of the Octagon, however, could not defend Poveglia from the continuous onslaught of the elements. Records concerning the restoration of San Vitale Church in 1559 and 1598 attest that the island's buildings were constantly battered by high tides and storms. The Octagon was also powerless against the third large-scale plague pandemic, which hit Venice between 1575 and 1577, which killed 1/3 of the population. And look, we might be sounding a bit like a broken record here, but no official accounts mention Poveglia as a place of bubonic disease. As in the previous century, Venetians died in the thousands in their homes or in the hospitals at St. Mary of Lazarus and Lazaretto Nuovo. At the start of the 17th century, Poveglia was mainly used as a repair station for ships entering and exiting the port of Malamocco. It appears that by this time the island was also served by an osteria or winery, surely to the delight of thirsty sailors. In 1630 and 1631, that relentless scourge, the plague, made yet another stop in the Venetian ports, leaving 50,000 dead. You should know the drill by now. None of them were buried, let alone burned alive on Poveglia. In 1661, after the umpteenth petition submitted by the descendants of the original inhabitants, the Venetian Senate yielded. The great-great-grandchildren of Poveglia thus returned to their place of origin with a bit of a sweet deal in their pockets. You see, the magistrature of the Old Reason stipulated that the government would retain ownership of the shipyard, warehouses, and winery, but the inhabitants of Poveglia could collect the rent on those buildings. Moreover, they received permission to convert a portion of the local cemetery into a vegetable garden. That supposedly enormous and haunted cemetery, last home to tens of thousands of tortured souls, was in fact rather small. Only a handful of laborers and wine cellars had been buried there, plus the occasional sailor who had died in an accident. The fact that part of it was repurposed as a vegetable patch speaks volumes on the actual number of cadavers haunting the island. As we enter the 18th century, we should clarify that there is a kernel of truth in the legends linking Poveglia to plague pandemics. In 1750, and then again in 1771, the admiral in charge of the port of Malamocco ordered incoming ships to stop at Poveglia for a quarantine period. The admiral's orders, however, were limited to those crews with little likelihood or suspicion of actually carrying the plague or other infectious diseases. On June 5th, 1793, a tartane flying an Ottoman flag was indeed quarantined in Poveglia. A tartane is a small fishing ship, by the way. Two of the sailors displayed the unmistakable symptoms of bubonic plague, and soon the contagion spread to other members of the crew. Eventually, 12 sailors died in the incident and were buried in Poveglia's cemetery. 6 years later, a Spanish brigantine was hit by the same scourge, which claimed 8 lives. Those were the last plague victims to be buried in the island's graveyard. So the maths is pretty simple. Poveglia's soil is the resting place for a grand total of 20 plague victims, a far cry from the 160,000 quoted by most sensationalist accounts. In the early 1800s, the territory of Venice and Poveglia itself switched hands several times. As a result of Napoleon's campaigns in Italy, the Republic of Venice fell and was assimilated into the fledgling Kingdom of Italy, a satellite of the Napoleonic Empire. During this period, the Church of San Vitale was converted into an army depot, and military engineers expanded the surface of Poveglia by building the second outer artificial island. After the fall of Napoleon, the region of Venetia was annexed by the Austrian Empire. In 1814, the Austrian military and Venice's Magistrate of Health took control of Poveglia, turning it into a naval health station, a function it fulfilled until the late 1940s. In 1819 and 1821, the health station dealt with a total of only 4 cases of plague. It's not clear if these were fatal, but in any case, the infected individuals were not buried on Poveglia. On April 28, 1828, Poveglia played host to a much more colourful, healthy and joyous guest, a live giraffe gifted by the Viceroy of Egypt to Emperor Francis I of Austria. The elongated mammal spent the regulation 40 days on Poveglia, naturally attracting the curiosity of the locals. The presence of the giraffe even inspired a popular fad, with fashionable ladies and gentlemen sporting hairdos and waistcoats mimicking the animal's long neck and leopard-like pattern. In the following decades, the Austrian government had bigger fish to fry than quarantining a giraffe. They directly ruled over most of the Italian northern regions, as well as exerting indirect control over many independent states within the fractured Italian peninsula. A movement known as Risorgimento, or Resurgence, advocated for the expulsion of Austrian influence and the pursuit of Italian unification. After several revolutions and 3 wars of independence, eventually Venice was restored to a unified Italy in October 1866. The Italian government continued to use Poveglia as a national health station, refurbishing existing buildings, permanently converting the Church of San Vitale into an administrative office, and building a modern hospital for sailors in 1888. In May 1915, Italy entered World War I, engaging in bitter trench warfare against old Austrian foes. Part of the hospital on Poveglia was turned into a POW camp, but otherwise the island saw little action until 1918. In August of that month, an Austrian aerial incursion attacked the islands, but it caused little damage. The following decade, the 1920s, were a tumultuous one for Italian society. Widespread street violence between far-left and far-right factions almost spiraled into civil war, a state of unrest which culminated with the rise to power of Benito Mussolini's fascist regime in October 1922. You may remember the popular histories of Poveglia claimed that in the same year, the island was home to a mental asylum directed by a sadistic psychiatrist. The deranged doctor allegedly performed horrible experiments on his patients until he jumped to his death from the bell tower, tormented by ghostly entities. We know for sure that such an institution never existed on the island. First of all, Poveglia was administered by the Royal Italian Navy, which arguably had no time nor inclination for advanced yet unethical psychiatric research. Second, Venice was already served by 2 psychiatric hospitals on the island of San Savolo and San Clemente. The former catered for male patients and the latter for female. One may argue that a mid-sized city like Venice did not need a third institution. And as an aside, in 1937, a woman called Ida Dalsa died of cerebral hemorrhage in Venice's San Clemente Asylum. Dalsa had been a lover of Benito Mussolini long before he became the Duce of Fascist Italy and bore him a son, Benito Albino, on November 11, 1915. Mussolini acknowledged the fatherhood of the boy, but after his rise to power, his agents tried to bury evidence of the relationship with Dalsa. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Dalsa insistently attempted to be acknowledged as a wife of Mussolini, resulting in her arrest, hospitalization, and eventual death. Also, her son, Benito Albino, died in an asylum in Milan in 1942. Both deaths are still regarded as suspicious, and the entire story is, in our opinion, far more interesting than some campfire tale about a cursed asylum that never even existed. But let's not lose sight of Poveglia. Following Italy's entry into World War II in June of 1940, the island resumed its dual role as naval hospital and POW camp, temporarily housing RAF crews downed by Italian anti-aircraft batteries. In later stages of the conflict, Venice suffered from Allied bombings, but Poveglia emerged unscathed. After the war, the military hospital was converted into a civilian facility, part nursing home, part hospice for chronic patients. The location was ill-suited for these purposes, though, and in December of 1969, the hospital was shut down. Its 144 patients were relocated elsewhere, and the building was closed. Soon thereafter, the entire island was vacated once more and vegetation took possession of the dilapidated hospital. Its ruins certainly made for an eerie and unsettling backdrop, which may have sparked the rumors about the haunted mental asylum. On September 15th, 1971, the island made it to the headlines. 2 days earlier, a gang of thieves had stolen 5 priceless paintings from a Venetian church, the Basilica of St. John's and Paul. The case was quickly solved thanks to a lawyer who offered a reward of 5 million liras, some $40,000 in today's value. Police informants quickly spilled the beans, revealing that the paintings were hidden in an abandoned building on Poveglia. Clearly, the abandoned island made for an enticing hideout for art thieves, but it was even more enticing to the team led by engineers Marcini and Tom Liolo, who in 1971 and 1972 conducted a groundbreaking pilot test. Or should I say, ground lifting. The engineers wanted to test a procedure to literally lift the surface of endangered coastal areas to protect them against rising seawaters. They excavated 78 boreholes 10 meters deep across an area of 900 square meters. They then injected into the boreholes a mixture of clay and cement, thus raising Poveglia's surface by 10 centimeters. The team continued to take measurements for the following 11 years, demonstrating that the land had subsided by only a single centimeter. On October 24th, 1985, non-profit organization Touring Club announced a partnership with Club Mediterranee to convert Poveglia into a tourist resort. The project combined low-cost accommodation with scientific labs to study the ecosystem of the lagoon. Venice's mayor enthusiastically supported the idea, but enthusiasm alone does not replenish coffers, and difficulties in raising the needed funds led to the cancellation of the project. For the ensuing decades, Poveglia remains largely abandoned and forgotten. As we know, in the 2000s, the island re-emerged into the public consciousness thanks to unfounded rumors and claims of paranormal activity. The Italian Public Property Agency, historically more preoccupied by the ghosts of public debt and recession, naturally ignored such stories and saw Poveglia as an asset to raise some cash. In May 2014, the agency kicked off an online auction, allowing private citizens and firms to buy a 99-year concession for Poveglia and all of its buildings. A group of residents of the nearby Malamocco district decided to participate in the auction, creating the Association Poveglia for Everybody. Their intent was to give the islands back to the community by establishing a public park, a marina, a study centre, as well as a youth hostel and a restaurant with affordable prices. The association's spokesman, Lorenzo Pizzola, explained that the people of Malamocco had a deep sentimental relationship with the island. To them, Poveglia was not a tangle of ghost-infested vegetation and ruins. It was a haven from daily grind and parental supervision. Young people came here to smoke their joints, have sex, have some shade from the adult world. It's tied to a lot of people's biographies. Some 4,500 citizens eventually joined the association, raising €444,000, that's almost $600,000 in today's value. Their offer, however, was outbid by a local entrepreneur with political ambitions, Luigi Brugnaro, who offered €513,000. His plan was to build a private hospital dedicated to the treatment of eating disorders. Public Property Agency deemed Brugnaro's offer too low and expected him to dish out more cash. To make his potential new offer legal, however, the Citizens Association had to submit a second bid too. In spokesman Pizzola's own words, "That's where we nailed him." The association simply refused to submit a new offer, thus voiding the auctioning process. If the association could not return Poveglia to the Venetians, then nobody would have it. Thus, Mr. Brugnaro was effectively prevented from taking control of the island. But don't feel sorry for him, though. As of June 2015, he was elected mayor of Venice. So that's nice. As per the Citizens Association, Poveglia for Everybody, they have not lost hope to return the island to the community. In 2018, the Administrative Regional Tribunal for Venetia ruled against the decision taken by the Public Property Agency back in 2014. According to the tribunal, the agency should have favoured the Citizens Association due to the, quote, important social goals underpinning the association's project. The Public Property Agency partially backtracked, providing special permits to Poveglia for Everybody so that they could perform maintenance, gardening, and cleaning work on the island. They even received authorization to organize festivals. In December 2022, Poveglia for Everybody partnered with 40 non-profit organizations in Venice to raise further funds to refurbish the island and turn it into an area open to the public. In February 2023, the Public Property Agency kicked off an exploratory project to put Poveglia up again for auction, alongside other properties in the lagoon, including the aforementioned San Clemente and the fortified island of San Andrea, once prison to the legendary serial seducer Casanova. At the time of preparing this episode, the auction has yet to be initiated, and the future of Poveglia is still uncertain. And we can now return to that famous initial claim from the Times. Is Poveglia the world's most haunted island? It could be argued that yes, it is haunted, not by paranormal entities, but by false memories created by unchecked rumors and sensationalistic reports, by the spectre of neglect and unregulated thrill-seeking tourism. What about ghosts? According to Lorenzo Pizzola, spokesman for Poveglia for Everybody, the only ghosts which now and then pop up in Poveglia are us, the Venetians, who just want to defend it. If you want to do your part in defending the memory of the island, please check out the already quoted Poveglia, the Island at the Origins of Venice by David Bussato and Paola Sofomeni. You can also read Bussato's blog, available also in English and French at the URL on the screen now.